So if you combine these, you essentially, I think, achieves or has a better chance of achieving execution excellence. So if you look at the values, behaviors, and attitude, right? These are the intrinsic software, as I call it, that operates at all levels, whether you're an individual, a team, because a team has its own dynamic, a division, or a company. A company has its own culture. Here are some of the examples of what I consider to be execution-oriented value behaviors and attitude. I don't claim this list to be comprehensive, because there could be many, many more. I love Ben Franklin, for those of you who know me. Right? He has 13 virtues. I took 2 of them. I stole 2 of his. One is being industry. The sheer fact that you work and you work hard has a value. And resolution, to adhere to what you do in a disciplined way. And the last I thought is integrity. But again, this is just some feelers out there. The behaviors. Behaviors are by definition things you could observe. These are physical manifestation of your beliefs, of your attitude. And that's the couple that I think is extremely important are respectful, teamwork, organizing, and then attitude. Attitude, can-do attitude. That's extremely important in an execution-oriented culture. Because if you believe the problem is greater than the solution, everybody throw up their hands and go home. Optimism, a resiliency, because failure is almost inevitable. It was funny, the other day I was just at my daughter's school meeting with the teacher and meeting with a math teacher, and I was asking the math teacher to make sure my daughter fails, you know, in a nicer way, but fails relatively early. Why? Because that builds resiliency. And I think one of the general problems with our society is as a whole, we like to pat each other on the back a little too much. But that's a separate problem. Next, I looked at competencies. Okay? There are many, many competencies. One of the best frameworks that I reviewed is by a company, actually by a researcher. His name is Lominger. He wrote a book called The Career Architect, and in there, he identified 67 competencies. We added a couple more, 2 more, to make it 69. And the top 10 competencies, again, these competencies are mostly at the individual level, but you could extrapolate them and make it team as well as company level, are being action-oriented. The ability to balance. Execution, at the end of the day, is very much of a balancing act. How many people here ever complain on a project that have too many resources, too much money, and too much time? It's typically, I don't have enough money, I don't have enough people, I don't have enough skill set, the time is impossible, how can anybody get anything done? So you're constantly balancing, if I do a little here, do a little there, maybe I could get this project done. Right? Conflict management. There are 3 types of conflicts that we look at typically. There's the process conflict, people who genuinely didn't agree on how to do things. And their relationship conflict, people who just hate each other. And the fact that I have a lot of old friends here means they at least didn't hate me very much. And then there's task conflict. Task conflict or prioritization conflict. For example, if you have a multi-cross-business unit type project, you have finance, marketing, let's say manufacturing, well, they have slightly different priorities. Right? Putting them together, working on a common project, inevitably will have task conflict. Any organization undertaking ERP, enterprise resource planning, will have these conflicts. It's just inherent in the nature of the people that you bring to work. But how do you resolve these conflicts? Because if you don't, it could spiral out of control and goes into a vicious cycle. Decision making. Decision making can be fast, can be slow, but is it effective? The key component about decision making is once a decision is made, is it adhered to? Because in a lot of organizations, the minute decision is made, next thing you know, people are backtracking left and right, or repositioning, or coming back for a second visit, or a third visit. Our US government just happened to have the wonderful experience of going through that recently, as I'm sure of you know. Delegation. Especially leaders in business execution have to delegate. Just one human. Even if you work 24 hours a day, that's 24 hours a day. You don't get 25 hours. So delegation is an important skill. Interpersonal savviness. You have to work with people. People want to work with you. Otherwise, the conflict on the relationship side just goes way high. Managerial courage. Especially leaders in business execution will have to make tough decisions. It's just unavoidable. And when you have a team who has very strong voice one, very strong voice two, what happens? Sometimes the leader has to sit back and say, you know what, we're going to do this. In what I found, the difference between non-profit organization and the for-profit organization, though, this actually varies quite a bit. In the for-profit organization, typically there's a greater central command, a chief, a VP who can make that decision. So generally speaking, this is now 2013, people tend to be more participative. So yes, we get all the ideas and et cetera, but somebody's willing to make that decision. In a nonprofit organization, I found there isn't that person who's able to make that kind of tough decision without overwhelming support from their peers and the various constituents. So in nonprofit organization, what happens is that you have to do surveys, studies, organization change, prioritization models, get everybody's buy-in, input, and finally come up with a decision which may not be perfect, but that the organization can live with. So the time it takes to make a decision in this case, for example, in managerial courage is in for-profit organization, it requires a little bit less of managerial courage because you use the process to dictate the outcome. By the way, the benefit of that typically is in the execution phase, people are genuinely more bought into the process. And that does actually expedite the execution. So they do catch up in some cases. Motivating other people, again, I think important training leaders. And then the last piece, problem solving. When I go on business interviews or meeting with clients, people ask me what I do, and sometimes I just say I solve problems. The ability to diagnose, to analyze, to articulate, to read back, to come up with recommendations, and then help them not only make the recommendations, but to implement the recommendations, is being execution-oriented. So these are sort of the top 10, what we believe are the important competencies. And then there are the integrating processes. These are the basic processes. Question?
I had a question. You talked about the top 10, which I agree with you, but maybe if you could speak to, because I think depending on the team that you're on, each team has a different personality, depending on the business that you're part of, they have a different culture, small, medium, large, global, local. What do you think from that 10 that you have, which they're all very important, what are the most critical to certain cultures or certain personalities?
That's a great question. As a good consultant would say, it depends, right? Practically everything depends on the context. If you work in an organization that is very, very hierarchical, decision tends to be top-down. It is generally easier to get to the point in which execution ready. A lot of these factors do still come into play. Right? Being able to be very action-oriented, for example, when the organization can make that rapid decision is probably more important than, let's say, my description of a nonprofit organization. Being action-oriented can be a hindrance. People could see you're just too gung-ho, right? We need the process to legitimize the action that needs to be taken. So it depends on the organization. My last company, again, name was held. When we implemented the ERP system, it took somewhere around 5 years to get enough momentum and support from the top leadership team before breaking the ground on that execution. So in those organizations, interpersonal skills, somewhere here, and maybe I should put politics up here, becomes extremely important. I once actually spoke to a friend who called me for just career advice, and we were just chatting. And I really didn't know her very well. It's a friend of a friend. And she told me that in her career, I don't know, let's say 15 years of career, she launched something around 15 different products. It's really quite impressive number. I'm sitting here thinking, in my 20 years experience, I launched, I think, 4 things. So, but I don't necessarily think my 4 things is less than that 15. It's just that it's in a very different organization setting. My previous organization is a very large company with offices in about 150 countries. So one initiative there actually was just rolling out a database is measuring years. While in a smaller startup, of course, they'll go through 5 projects and products in less than 6 months. So there is no easy answer to your question. Now, in the appendix later, you'll see I'll list all 69 competencies. So you could figure out which one's the best. Any other questions?